When Barron Trump gave up his first-class seat to an elderly veteran, no one could have anticipated the family secret that would come to light mid-flight. What happened next left every passenger on board speechless. The cabin lights flickered softly as passengers settled into their seats, the faint hum of engines blending with murmured conversations. It was a brisk morning at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, and Flight 247 to Newark was bustling with the usual mix of pre-flight chaos and anticipation. Among the crowd was a young man seated in first class, Barron Trump, the youngest son of former President Donald Trump. Dressed simply in a navy blue sweater and jeans, Barron sat quietly by the window, immersed in a book. His tall frame and recognizable face drew subtle glances from the other passengers. Despite the whispers, Barron seemed to fade into his own world, indifferent to the attention. Meanwhile, in the crowded economy section, an elderly man shuffled down the aisle with the help of a flight attendant. His face was lined with years of experience, his posture bent slightly, but his eyes carried a spark of resilience. Dressed in a worn jacket adorned with a single military pin, he clutched his boarding pass, which indicated a middle seat in the very back of the plane. As passengers adjusted their bags and settled into their seats, one interaction was about to set the tone for the entire journey. A flight attendant paused near Barron's seat, explaining the veteran's situation. What Barron did next was something no one saw coming. As the flight attendant explained the situation, Barron listened attentively. The elderly veteran, Mr. Robert Jenkins, had been assigned a cramped seat in the last row. Given his age and the clear discomfort etched on his face, it was evident that the journey would be difficult for him. Barron closed his book and looked toward the economy cabin. Without hesitation, he stood and spoke softly to the flight attendant. "He can have my seat," Barron said, his tone calm and resolute. The attendant blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Are you sure?" she asked. "This is a long flight." Barron nodded. "He deserves it more than I do." Before anyone could object, Barron picked up his belongings and gestured toward Mr. Jenkins. "Sir," he said kindly, "please take my seat. It's much more comfortable up here." Mr. Jenkins hesitated, clearly surprised. "Son, I appreciate the thought, but you don't need to do this for me." Barron smiled. "It's the least I can do for someone who served our country. My grandfather would have done the same." As the veteran reluctantly accepted, passengers nearby began to murmur, their surprise palpable. Barron carried his things to the back of the plane, settling into Mr. Jenkins's assigned seat without complaint. The stark contrast between first class and economy didn't seem to bother him in the slightest. What happened next, however, would turn this simple act of kindness into a story that no one on Flight 247 would ever forget. As Mr. Jenkins eased into Barron's first-class seat, the flight attendant offered him a warm smile and a glass of water. The murmurs among passengers quieted, but the atmosphere remained charged with curiosity. Who was this young man who had so selflessly given up his seat? Settling into his new seat, Mr. Jenkins leaned back and sighed, visibly more comfortable. As the flight progressed, a curious passenger seated next to him asked, "Do you know who that young man is?" The veteran glanced toward the back of the plane, where Barron sat unassumingly. "No idea," Mr. Jenkins replied, though his tone carried intrigue. It wasn't long before the realization dawned on him. "Trump," he whispered, catching sight of Barron's features. A flood of memories swept over him as he stared out the window. He turned to the curious passenger and said, "I think I might have met his grandfather once, many years ago." The passenger leaned in, eager to hear more. Mr. Jenkins began recounting a moment from decades earlier when he had fallen on hard times after returning from the war. "I was trying to make ends meet," he explained, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "I had a family to feed and nowhere to go. That's when a man named Fred Trump stepped in. He gave me a job and a place to stay when no one else would." As he shared his story, the people around him listened intently, their interest spreading through the cabin like wildfire. Little did they know the connection between Fred Trump and Mr. Jenkins was about to reveal something even more remarkable. The flight continued in its usual rhythm, But in first class, Mr. Jenkins' story began to ripple through the cabin. Passengers leaned in, captivated by his tale. "Fred Trump didn't just give me a job," Mr. Jenkins continued. "He treated me like family. He checked on me, made sure my kids had what they needed. He even helped me get back on my feet after a rough patch." A flight attendant, overhearing the conversation, decided to approach Barron in the economy section. She knelt beside his seat and quietly relayed the story. "Did you know your grandfather helped this man decades ago?" she asked gently. Barron's eyes widened, a mix of surprise and admiration washing over his face. "No," he said softly, shaking his head. "I had no idea. That's incredible." The flight attendant nodded, clearly moved. "You're more like your grandfather than you realize," she added with a smile. Back in first class, Mr. Jenkins continued. "People like Fred Trump, people who step in when no one else will, they leave a mark. A legacy." His voice faltered for a moment, the weight of the memories evident. As the plane soared above the clouds, a quiet understanding began to form among the passengers. This was no ordinary flight. It was a moment where past and present collided, and the values of generosity and kindness transcended time. What happened next cemented this flight as an experience no one would forget. As the plane cruised high above the clouds, the pilot announced that the cabin crew would begin the in-flight service. But before the trays rolled out, an unexpected gesture captured everyone's attention. Barron quietly rose from his seat in the economy section and made his way back to first class. The cabin fell silent as passengers watched him approach Mr. Jenkins, who looked up in mild surprise. "Mr. Jenkins," Barron began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I just learned about what my grandfather did for you. I didn't know this part of his story, but hearing it now makes me so proud to be his grandson." The veteran smiled warmly. "Your grandfather was a great man, son, and today you proved that his legacy lives on." Barron reached into his pocket and pulled out a handwritten note. "I wrote this just now," he said, handing it to Mr. Jenkins. "It's a thank you for your service and for reminding me of the values my family stands for." The passengers, now fully invested in the exchange, watched with rapt attention. Mr. Jenkins unfolded the note, his hands trembling slightly. As he read the words, his eyes glistened with unshed tears. "This means more to me than you'll ever know," he said softly. At that moment, a ripple of applause broke out in the cabin. Strangers, moved by the act of kindness and the profound connection revealed mid-flight, clapped for both Barron and the veteran. The atmosphere was no longer just that of a typical flight. It was one of unity and shared humanity. What Barron did next, however, would take the experience to an even deeper level. As the applause settled, Barron did something that left the entire cabin stunned. He reached out to shake Mr. Jenkins's hand and said, "I believe acts of kindness shouldn't stop here. I'd like to help continue what my grandfather started." Mr. Jenkins looked puzzled. "What do you mean, son?" Barron smiled. "I'm setting up a scholarship fund for veterans and their families in honor of my grandfather and people like you who have served this country. You've inspired me to make sure this legacy of kindness continues." The cabin erupted into cheers. Passengers applauded, some wiping away tears, others smiling warmly. The once distant crowd of strangers had transformed into a community united by a shared moment of compassion. Mr. Jenkins, overcome with emotion, simply said, "Thank you. Fred would be proud of you, and so am I." As the plane prepared for landing, the passengers carried with them a story they would recount for years to come. A story of a young man who reminded them that compassion and generosity could bridge any divide. When the flight touched down in Newark, Barron helped Mr. Jenkins with his luggage and walked with him to the terminal. Reporters, alerted by passengers who had shared the story online, waited to capture the moment. But Barron waved them off, declining the spotlight. "This wasn't about me," he said quietly. "It's about remembering what truly matters: kindness, respect, and the connections that bring us all together." And with that, Barron and Mr. Jenkins parted ways, leaving behind a moment that would inspire countless others to carry forward a legacy of empathy and generosity.